Okay, we're recording. Tom's got it as usual.
And like last week, we'll wait until a couple of minutes past 1 just to give people time
Mhm.
to join. I don't, because we have Professor Peters here today, I don't want to take too much time past 1 to get the meeting started officially.
So it is in the chat. We are going to be recording. The recorder's on already.
Hey, everybody. Can you
Yeah,
hear and see me? This is C.J. Peters.
Yes.
we can.
Yes,
We
we
can,
have you.
Professor.
Yes,
Oh,
thank
excellent.
you.
Excellent. Good. I can see lots of faces. I have a kind of a small screen, so I'm kind of squishing everything on one part of the screen and my notes are on the other part. So I apologize if I'm kind of looking off to the side on occasion, but good. I'm glad you can see me and you can hear me and you can see me as well.
Yeah,
As
yeah.
as you will get to know, we are very down to earth, everyday, regular people. We are not expecting perfection at
Oh,
all.
that's good.
Yeah. But
That's good. I like to hear that.
we certainly have all gotten used to these Zoom and Teams calls over the last 5 years. So
Yes.
we know how it works, Professor.
Yeah.
You look great, you sound great. So
Mhm.
we're excited.
It's a
Yes.
little dark here, as it probably is where you are. I don't because we just had some thunderstorms pass through, so I've got a bunch of lights on in my office here in my house, but um, I'm never sure, how it actually looks on the other side of the screen. So, but let me know if you can't hear me, if I fade out or something. Just shoot me a chat or speak up. And I'm assuming we're just going to wait till 1 to get started. And Sue, or are you going to sort of get things started, or
I
someone
sure
else?
am. And I'm
Okay,
going
good.
to introduce you and I'll give you a really obvious cue when it's your time to roll.
Okay, good.
All right.
More obvious, the better. That's great.
Yes.
Yeah. It's great to see so many people here. Hi, Brenda. Good morning.
Hello.
Good afternoon. It still feels like morning, but it's actually not. Chris, good morning. Good afternoon, Chris. We're just gonna wait one more minute and then we'll officially get started and we'll hope others just continue to join.
And Tom, I'm going to trust you to cue it up when we're ready. So give me a nudge. You. Yes.
I'd give it at least until 1:02, just in case for technical difficulties.
Yes.
But we can fill the time with playful banter.
Yes.
Of course.
So
Oh my,
Danny,
I
Dan,
did not want to pin anyone in particular out for fear that I would make others feel not important. But I do have to say we have Dia Paris on the call all the way from Battle Creek, Michigan. And Dia
wow,
was one of the key handlers and organizers for Sherrod Brown. And so I'm super excited that he's with us.
that's
Hey,
awesome.
nice to see you.
Diep, what brings you to Battle Creek? I grew up right near there. That's where I was born and
Oh,
raised.
Oh,
Oh
cool.
wow! So you're also somebody that was born and raised in Battle Creek. So yeah, that's my hometown.
No
Yeah.
kidding.
So yeah. I'm actually on the highway on the way to DC right now. So leaving
Oh,
Battle
wow.
Creek, but yeah, joining from the Pennsylvania Turnpike.
oh
I actually,
boy.
I actually grew up, well, make sure you watch the road.
Yes.
I know how tricky the Pennsylvania Turnpike can be. I actually grew up in between Battle Creek and Kalamazoo in a little town called Richland,
Yeah,
but
I know
I know the area well. Yeah.
Good, good.
So, Professor Peters, my company that I work for is in Lawton, Michigan.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yes,
What company is that, if you don't mind me asking?
not at all. It's Randall Residence.
Oh, no kidding. That's
Yes.
cool.
Assisted
Yeah.
living and memory care. We're in 4 different states. Mhm.
Yeah, my old stomping grounds for sure. I won't advertise it too much, but you may be able to see in my camera angle that there's a poster, a sign, a framed cover of Sports Illustrated on my wall from my alma mater, the University of Michigan Wolverines. I have to keep that kind of quiet around these parts because most people are not Wolverines fans around here. But in case anyone was wondering what that is, I do have a connection to the University of Michigan because I went there for law school. So
As I
my
reviewed
excuse.
your introduction, I was considering injecting an OH, IO.
Well,
But
I did it for you. I broke the ice for you. So, that's the elephant in the room.
Yes.
We got that out of the way.
We have a bunch of parents of grads, married to grads. I just saw one pop up. Hi, Lexi. So of Ohio State. So
Yeah.
them's fighting words, Professor Peters. I hope you're good.
know.
I hope
I
you live up
promise
to
not
that
to.
Michigan law school hype.
I'll
telling ya.
try not to inject that into my remarks at all. But I just, I like to be honest, and I thought I would just put that out there since we were talking about Battle Creek.
Well, Tom, we're at 102. Do we have the green light?
Yeah, let's do it. We are recording this, so we're able to provide it out to everyone that is unable to be here today and still share all of our message. So I'm ready to go if you're ready to go.
Fantastic. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the March 16th meeting of the Lady Liberty League. My name is Sudha Richko, and I am one of the league founders. First and foremost, I just want to extend a genuine thank you to all of you for joining today. It's absolutely encouraging to see our community join as league members to work towards our shared mission of promoting liberty, leadership, and legacy. Your engagement plays an important role in our league's growth, and we appreciate the collective energy and passion that you bring to the table. As we continue to grow, just please remember that every conversation, every new member, and every shared idea strengthens our core mission. Unified as league members will make a difference in spreading awareness and fostering education on the issues that matter most. The Lady Liberty League is a pro-democracy group. Our league's keystone is empowering league membership through education and awareness with, of course, verified quality sources. The goal is to improve how each of us shows up in our daily lives to create a larger culture shift that supports the foundational systems that have allowed the existence of our constitutional republic for almost 250 years. And the process of achieving that is through esteemed guest speakers in their area of expertise. So at this point, I'll turn it over to the other league founders, just in case I left anything out, and to ask co-founder and our amazing moderator, Tom Early, just to lay out some brief framework and some ground rules for today's meeting. Take it away, Tom.
Hi, thanks everyone for being here. I just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time out of their day being here. How we'll moderate after as Professor C.J. goes on with his free speech basics information for everyone. I would ask that everyone puts their questions into the chat, and we will save those questions for after his presentation, and we'll go through them. Other than that, I'm ready for this. I'm pretty excited. So hopefully everyone can take all of the information they learned here today and into the real world, So thanks.
Great. And before I move on to introducing our guest speaker, I just want to point out our other co-founders, Laura Hudak and Walt Gaychuk. And if you have anything you want to say briefly before we introduce our guest, now is the time.
Go ahead, Laura.
Let's move on with the professor.
Great.
I would just like to say thank you for everyone being on, and please help spread the word. There's a lot of great content moving forward, and I want to thank Professor C.J. to bring some positive message today to the society we find ourselves in. So thank you, Professor.
Great. Thank you both. And so I will continue on with our introduction. So today we are thrilled to welcome a distinguished guest speaker, Professor Christopher J. Peters. Professor Peters is the C. Blake McDowell Junior Professor of Law at the University of Akron School of Law, where he served as dean from 2017 to 2022. With over 30 years of experience in legal education, Professor Peters has made significant contributions to constitutional law, legal theory, and federal civil procedure. His work has been published in some of the most prestigious law reviews, including the Harvard Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, and the Columbia Law Review. He has authored or edited 2 books on legal theory. A Michigan native, as we covered, Peters earned his bachelor's degree from Amherst College and a law degree from the University of Michigan. He practiced civil litigation in Chicago, and he currently resides in Hudson, Ohio. We're so grateful for his time today, and I'm sure we'll learn a great deal from his insights. Thank you, Professor Peters, for joining us and engaging in these important discussions that directly impact our daily lives.
Thank you, Sue. I really appreciate that introduction, and I very much appreciate the invitation to join you today. I very much appreciate all of you being here and taking time out of your Sunday to devote to these kinds of issues. I think that's very important for our democracy. A healthy democracy relies on citizens becoming engaged and educating themselves about the issues and about how government works, how government is supposed to work. So it's really, really encouraging to see all of you doing that today and doing that as part of your organization. And so thanks for doing that. I'm excited to see all of these faces here today. And I hope that I can kind of participate in and foster a conversation today. The topic here is free speech basics. Free speech is a huge topic, as you may know. And my plan is just to spend, I don't know, about 15 minutes or so. I'm looking at the clock right now to keep myself honest. Just going over 5 basic points or principles of free speech under the First Amendment. And then I want to turn it over to all of you for discussion, for conversation, Q&A, comments, etc. I hope it will be relatively informal. I got a great list of potential questions yesterday, and I took a look at those, and I'm hoping that I can answer some of those questions if folks want to ask them, but I'll do my best to answer any questions that people may have. So let me move into just these 5 basic points that I want to make about the free speech clause, and I'm trying to do this in a way that will appeal to and inform folks who may have a fair amount of knowledge about the First Amendment already, and also for folks who may not have a heck of a lot of familiarity with it. I'm hoping that I'm not too elementary or too advanced, but when we get to the Q&A, if there's stuff that I've said that doesn't make any sense, please let me know and I'll try to explain it further. Okay, so 5 basic principles. I didn't bring a PowerPoint. I thought I might, but I thought that might be a little too formal. So I'm just going to go through this orally. 5 basic principles about free speech under the First Amendment that I think are really important for every citizen to know. The first one is a short one, but a very important one, which is this. The First Amendment, including the free speech clause of the First Amendment, applies to everybody within the jurisdiction of the United States. It protects the speech of everybody within the jurisdiction of the United States, not just citizens. That's actually true of most of our constitutional rights, by the way. So, for example, a case that's been in the news recently, a lawful permanent resident alien, such as Mahmoud Khalil, who is a protester, pro-Palestinian protester who was arrested last week by ICE agents and is still being detained, has not been charged with a crime, apparently was arrested because of the content of his views that he was expressing in those protests. He is a lawful permanent alien. He is not a citizen of the United States, but he enjoys the same free speech protections that I do as a citizen of the United States. So it's important to keep in mind that the First Amendment protects the rights not just of citizens, but of anybody who is within the jurisdiction of this country. That's the first point. Second point, the protections of the First Amendment apply only to government restrictions of speech. They don't apply to restrictions of speech by private citizens or private entities like corporations. So here's a very simple example of that, right? So suppose Paula protester is peacefully distributing leaflets on a public street corner, protesting the government's policy in Gaza, let's just say. Paula's expression is protected by the First Amendment in that context. So she's arrested and charged under a statute that prohibits speech that's critical of the government. Her First Amendment rights have been violated there. But suppose that instead of a public street corner, Paula is distributing her leaflets in the parking lot of a private shopping mall. And suppose the manager of the shopping mall doesn't like what she's saying and asks her to leave. And if she doesn't leave, the manager calls the police and has her arrested for trespassing. Paula's First Amendment rights are not implicated there because a private party, in this case, the owner of the shopping center, does not violate the First Amendment when they limit speech on their property, even if they call the authorities to enforce the trespassing laws, the state's trespassing laws, in order to enforce their property rights. So it's important to keep in mind that the First Amendment does not apply to private attempts to restrict somebody's speech on their own property. Now, here's a more nuanced example, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about this later in the conversation. Suppose Paula's Facebook account is suspended because her use of the Facebook platform to protest the government's Gaza policy violates Facebook's content guidelines. I don't know that it would. My understanding is Facebook no longer has content guidelines, but let's just suppose that's what happens. So Facebook is a private company, and they can censor speech on their social media platform, which they own, without violating the First Amendment, just like the shopping mall owner can censor speech on their property without violating the First Amendment. Just like I can kick somebody out of my dinner party at my home if I don't like what they're saying without violating the First Amendment, right? And in fact, Facebook itself is a speaker whose speech, including their editorial choices about which speech to allow on their own platform, is protected First Amendment conduct. And so the government cannot, without at least implicating the First Amendment, tell Facebook that it must allow Paula, protester, to post her content on its private platform. That would violate the First Amendment itself. So that's an important point, the difference between, private and government restrictions of speech, and just understanding that the First Amendment applies only to government restrictions, but not to private restrictions of speech. And we may have the opportunity to talk about some of that a little bit later. Third basic point. The government has some ability to control speech on government property, but it depends on the type of government property involved. So if the speech occurs in a so-called traditional public forum, like a public park or on the public sidewalks, for instance, these are places which by long tradition have been devoted to assembly and public debate, things like that. If speech occurs in a traditional public forum like that, then the government can impose reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on the speech. So, for example, the government could require you to get a permit before you have a mass protest march down the city streets in the middle of rush hour, or before you have a big assembly or demonstration in the public park. But the permit cannot depend on the content or the viewpoint of your speech. Any restrictions imposed on speech in one of these traditional public forums must serve a significant government interest, such as public safety, for example. And they must leave open ample alternative channels to communicate your message. So the city of Cleveland couldn't just say, we're going to ban all public protests on our streets and our parks, because that would not leave open ample communication, ample alternative channels for communication of the messages that people might want to communicate through public demonstrations or public protests. So that's traditional public forums. Speech is very protected in those forums. But there are other kinds of government property too, right? So consider a government office building, which is not a traditional place where people show up, to express their ideas, right? It's a place where work gets done on the part of the government. That's going to be what we call a non-public forum. In a place like that, the government has a lot more leeway to control the speech that happens in that location. The government can impose reasonable restrictions, including content-based restrictions on that speech, as long as they're reasonable in light of the purpose of the forum. So, for instance, I work at a public university. A public university is not a traditional public forum, although at times it might be. It's a forum that has a particular purpose, right, of educating people. And so the university can, which is an organ of the state, can impose reasonable restrictions on speech in the public forum, including controlling the curriculum and things like that, as long as they're reasonable in light of the purpose of the forum. So the government does have some authority to control speech on public property, but it really depends on the type of public property we're talking about, right? And maybe we can talk more about that in the Q&A as well. All right, that's the third point, I think. Only two more to go. The fourth basic principle about free speech. And that is that the First Amendment does not impose limits on the government's own speech, on speech by the government, with a couple of important caveats there that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So, for example, this is based on a real case. It didn't happen in Ohio, but suppose the state of Ohio issues vehicle license plates with logos on them. You can get a logo or a slogan or something on the license plate to support some particular organization or cause that you believe in. So you could get an Ohio State Buckeyes license plate, right? Some of you may have them. Or you can get a license plate supporting the veterans of foreign wars and have their logo. All sorts of organizations and causes. You've all seen these license plates before. The state can decide that it will not issue a license plate bearing the logo of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Why can it do that? Because it's government speech. The court has said that license plates are government speech. And in the government, even though the First Amendment does not allow the government in most cases to censor private speech, it does allow the government to censor its own speech. Okay, so we need to keep that in mind. The government can censor speech if the speech itself is the government's own speech. But there are a couple of important caveats to that. I'll just mention, there are more than a couple, but I'll mention the most important sort of exceptions to that rule, right? First of all, sometimes the government's own speech might cross the line into coercion of private speech, right? So for example, if the government tells a private university that it's going to withhold government funds from that university unless the university discontinues its DEI programming, That's not just government speech, right? It's the government essentially coercing the university with respect to the university's own speech. It's private speech, and that does raise First Amendment concerns. And then the second caveat that I'll mention here is we talk about the First Amendment. We often talk about the First Amendment as kind of a placeholder or a synonym for free speech, but the First Amendment has a lot of other content in it as well, including 2 religion clauses that protect the freedom of religion. And those religion clauses do impose limitations on government speech when that government speech crosses the line into endorsement of religious activity or religious belief. So there are some limitations there that come from the religion clauses of the First Amendment that might prevent the government from speaking in some cases, or from saying what the government might want to say in some cases. Okay, fifth and final free speech principle, and then we can get into some Q&A and some conversation, I hope. The fifth principle is that the First Amendment generally works to protect or to prohibit the government from censoring or punishing speech based on the content of the speech. That's sort of a core First Amendment principle, that the government is heavily restricted in its ability to decide which speech to reward or to punish or to censor based on the content of the speech. And a sub-principle there is that the government is virtually always prohibited from censoring speech based on the viewpoint expressed by the speech. Okay, so here's an example. If the state government tells a private university, hello?
This is Amy.
Hi, sorry, just I heard someone talking. I wasn't sure if someone wanted to say something, but we'll get to Q&A in just a second. I'm almost done, I promise. So if the government prohibits a private university from teaching on the subject of
Sorry, Professor, you are muted. Can you unmute?
Sorry, I'm not sure what I did there. How long, what was the last thing I said that you heard?
You had just made a comment, thinking you had heard a question.
Oh, okay. I must have clicked. I probably clicked my space bar or something by mistake. I apologize. Okay. So the fifth principle here is that the First Amendment, the way it generally works is it limits the government's ability to censor speech based on the content of the speech. And it prohibits the government from censoring speech based on the viewpoint of the speech. So when we're talking about content, we're talking about the subject matter of the speech, right? So the example I was using was if the government, if the state or federal government tells a private university that it cannot, this is obviously something, I'm using university examples because I teach in a university, so they just come readily to mind. But if the government tells a private university that they cannot teach about diversity, equity, or inclusion, that would be a content-based restriction on speech, because it says that it's censoring speech based on the subject matter of the speech, right? And most of the time, the government's not going to be able to do that unless they can show some really compelling reason why they need to. But if the government tells the university that it cannot teach a particular viewpoint about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that would be a viewpoint-based restriction of speech, not just content-based, but also censoring it based on which side of a dispute you're advocating. And that's virtually always prohibited. The government cannot do that without violating your free speech rights. Now, there are a couple caveats there. One of them is that there are some categories of speech that the courts treat as quote unquote unprotected speech, where the government can always censor your speech. So the most important categories here are incitement of illegal activity, threats against somebody, obscenity. Those are probably the most important categories of unprotected speech, where the government can censor you based on the content of the speech. And second, I mentioned earlier that the government has greater leeway on some of the government's own property, right? If it's not a a place that is traditionally used for free expression, like just a government office building, for instance, or a university classroom, perhaps, the government does have more leeway to control content of the speech in those contexts. Okay, those are the 5 basic points or principles of free speech that I wanted to communicate to you. And now I'm done with that part of my talk. So I'm hoping now that we can move into sort of more of a general conversation with Q&A and comments and everything else. And Tom, did I understand correctly that you are going to sort of moderate this from the chat? Is that how it's going to go, or how do you want to handle that?
Yeah, I did send you a list of questions that I had prepared just in case, but there are a couple in the chat already that I'd love to start with. One was just reiterating, I believe you mentioned it earlier, but anywhere that is in the US jurisdiction, the First Amendment applies to regardless of status of person. Is that correct? Or is there more nuance to that?
Well, there's a little more nuance to it. I guess the 2 areas of nuance are that it's not always clear what counts as in US jurisdiction. So, if the United States is trying to punish people, US citizens, for their speech that happens to occur in some other country, we're still going to be within US jurisdiction there as United States citizens, but non-citizens might not be. So there's some nuance there for stuff that happens outside the territorial borders of the United States. And that's some really complicated case law that I'm not even an expert in. So, but we can put that to one side, I think. I think the other nuance there is related to that. The courts have always given the federal government, not the state governments, but the federal government, more latitude when it comes to immigration related matters, in particular in deciding who comes into the country, right? So it's probably true that the federal government could decide who gets into the country in the first place, as long as they do so according to fairly clear rules, based on, the content of their speech, right? Once they're here, though, now they have the protections of the First Amendment for the most part. And certainly once they get what we call the green card, or the lawful permanent residency here in the United States, even if they're not a citizen, essentially their First Amendment rights are the same as the rights of a citizen would be.
Thanks for that. The next question that we saw in there was from Laura, who asked, when is speech prohibited when it could provoke violence? And it did make me think of Justice Holmes saying, hey, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. I assume there's more case law that kind of follows this, where there are restrictions when it comes to the safety of those around you. Can you speak more to that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And yeah, you're right. That was Justice Holmes who said that in a case back from the 1920s. And the principle still applies, right? But the full quote was, you can't falsely shout fire in a crowded theater, right? And the implication there, as the case law is developed, is that the government can prevent you, indeed can punish you for inciting illegal activity. So if you are speaking in a way that you intend to cause somebody to commit violence, for instance, an illegal violent act, and that is actually imminently likely to do that, so the person, upon hearing your speech, is actually likely to go out pretty much right then and there and commit some violent or illegal activity, the government can prevent you from doing that and can punish you for doing that. But that's a pretty limited exception. And the courts have limited it, to a situation where you intend to cause violent activity and you're actually likely to do that. So just sort of advocating in the future some sort of abstract, like overthrow of the government in the abstract, that's not enough for the government to be able to restrict your speech, that speech is still protected, right? So it has to be something that really poses that, what used to be called a clear and present danger of some violent or illegal activity. And you have to remember that, I think, for people who may be engaged, maybe politically active, what you don't want to do if you want to maintain your free speech protections is you don't want to, call for people to go out and commit some violent act, right? Because that is going to be outside probably your free speech protections. Threats are a very similar concept. So speech that threatens some identifiable person or group of persons with bodily harm is not protected speech. So, we want to avoid that kind of speech as well, not only because it's, harmful, but because the government can control that speech or punish you for that kind of speech without violating the First Amendment. So those are some examples there. There are limitations, based on well-established case law that allows the government to basically protect the public safety when it's necessary to do that by limiting someone's speech. But they're pretty limited cases.
That does, it makes me feel there are follow-up questions to that. When we have some other protests that are large and public, but the introduction of a more tense environment when government officials show up perhaps armed in a way that says they are protecting public safety, but are introducing a more dangerous environment. Are there protections for the people in that case, or is it a legal way for government to restrict that free speech exercise?
Yeah, it's a great question. It touches on some of the gray areas in free speech law, I think, and it implicates just the fact that the law doesn't cover everything. So if you are engaged in a peaceful protest, and if you have met all of, if there's a permit requirement that had to be met before that protest could take place, and you've done what you need to do to get that permit, and you are not threatening anybody, you are not breaking any laws, you're not destroying property, you're not trespassing on private property, right? If you're obeying the law and engaging in your right to peacefully protest, the government has no right to arrest you, detain you, prevent you from doing what you're doing. But I think the question is a really good one. It's a subtle one because it kind of raises this issue of kind of an intimidation effect, even if the police, let's say, are not actually intervening in a protest, just the potential intimidation effect of having armed officers there watching you and watching what you're doing. And I think that's an area where the law, probably doesn't govern that conduct unless there's some active attempt to prevent you from exercising your legal rights, which is not easy to show if the police officers are not active, going into the crowd and detaining people or assaulting people. If there's no active attempt like that, it's probably within the government's authority to do that, right? And I think one of the, I think the best defense that people can have against that sense of intimidation is to know what their legal rights are, and to know that the government really, is not going to, because they don't have the right to interfere with you exercising your First Amendment right to peacefully protest, right? That doesn't remove, it wouldn't remove for me the lingering fear, right? That, your rights might be violated in that case. But the law can only do so much. The law is, and this is a theme that I don't know, we may come back to this, but the law is words in a book. The First Amendment is, when you get down to its essence, it's words on a piece of parchment. And it requires lots of people to be vigilant in making sure that First Amendment rights are followed and that violations of those rights are called out. And it requires at some level government officials to respect the First Amendment, including at the end of the day, I think, judicial officials, judges, and it requires law enforcement officers, including the most powerful law enforcement officers in the state or the country, right? The governor in the case of the state, president in the case of the country. It requires them ultimately to respect what the courts say and to respect the law. There's no magic formula that can make sure that happens. I think the best defense against that not happening is exactly what's happening right here on this call, which is a bunch of engaged citizens, thinking about these issues and talking about these issues and talking to their friends and colleagues and about these issues and family members, because, democracy dies in darkness. I think that's the Washington Post's slogan. But I guess the corollary of that is that the more light we can shine on these issues and the more attention that we can pay and the more protesting we can do in various ways, if the government is not respecting the rule of law, the better. Sorry, I kind of went off on a bit of a tangent there, but it's a great question, and it really does expose, the fact that the law has to be a living thing, and that we all have to do what we can to make sure people are aware of it, and that our government respects our legal rights.
All of it. There's so many good nuggets of information here, and it's all what we would love to hear as well. So I appreciate that thought out answer. I do think it kind of lends into one of our next questions, which we mentioned early, or you mentioned early in your presentation, but the recent detention of Mahmoud Khalil and where the government is deciding to step in to limit that free speech. Are they violating a law? Are they too narrowly reviewing existing legislation to be able to enforce that, to stop him? I think one of the more recent laws that this administration is enacting is a law from 1798 with the Alien Act. Is that what it was?
Enemy Aliens Act.
Alien
Enemies Act. Yeah, thank you. So how does the government balance that, right? We're taking 2 centuries old law and applying it to today's logic, and I guess technically on paper it's allowed, but like, are we violating that spirit when we talk about protecting that all the pieces here of what makes free speech free speech?
Yeah, another great question. There's layers to it, right? And you just said, Tom, technically on paper it may be allowed. I'm not sure that it is, right? It depends on what paper you look at. So there are a couple statutes there. I'm not experts in either of them. I think the statute that Mahmoud Khalil was arrested under supposedly is an immigration statute that purports to allow the president to deport any alien, any non-citizen, if they threaten U.S. foreign policy interests or something like that. That statute has only been tested once in court in terms of whether it's constitutional, right? So just because a statute says something doesn't mean that it's consistent with the First Amendment or with other provisions of the Constitution. It was tested once many years ago. Ironically, the president's sister, Judge Trump, who's now retired, held that the law was unconstitutional. But it it was overturned on other grounds and it was never appealed to the Supreme Court. So that particular statute may very well be a violation of the First Amendment in how it's being applied to Mr. Khalil. The other statute you mentioned, the Alien Enemies Act, a 200-plus-year-old statute. It's only been invoked 3 times in our history: War of 1812, First World War, World War II. It's a statute that says that if there is a declared war, meaning declared by Congress against a foreign nation, that nationals, citizens or subjects of that foreign nation who pose a threat can be deported. Or if a foreign government or nation is invading our country or threatening to invade our country, that its nationals can be deported. Neither of those, to my knowledge, is true of Venezuela or I can't remember the other country that just today a number of the State Department announced they were deporting a number of citizens of another country on the ground that another Central American country, on the ground that they were members of a gang. Well, no one has declared war against Venezuela. Congress has not declared war against Venezuela. As far as I can tell, Venezuela is not mounting an invasion of the United States. So I don't think that, not being an expert in that particular statute, I don't think that statute even applies here. But if it does, even if a statute purports to allow, the president or those under his control to do these kinds of things, we still have to ask whether it's consistent with the Constitution, including the First Amendment. And I think the Khalil case is very disturbing, because I think that this is a situation where you have someone who's a lawful permanent resident who's entitled, as I mentioned earlier, to all of the protections of the First Amendment that we're entitled to. There are some circumstances under which he might be deported, but that's a process that goes through a civil immigration law system. It's not a process that justifies arresting and detaining somebody and keeping them without access to lawyers, which is what the government is doing now. And to do that with someone without charging them with an actual crime, based quite clearly, I think, on the fact that the administration does not like the content of Mr. Khalil's speech in the form of some protests that he has participated in and helped organize, to me, is a clear violation of the First Amendment. So that's a very disturbing case, in part because President Trump has said that there will be many more arrests like the arrest of Mr. Khalil. And we're starting to get some reports now that there have been, or that there have been attempts at least, to detain some other non-citizens with lawful residency in this country who were involved in protests. So it's very, very disturbing to me that that's going on right now. And I think we need to be paying a lot of attention to that.
It's a very troubling topic for sure. So again, appreciate the extra time we're spending talking about it. Just to kind of switch it a little, we spoke a little about what government can and cannot restrict, essentially cannot impose any censorship. But we have an interesting situation with Tesla where it seems like they're supporting a certain viewpoint. Is the government required to remain neutral in these cases, or can they promote a specific vision of speech as long as it's not religion, as the clauses you mentioned? And then vice versa, is there any restrictions against citizens on protesting Tesla because the government then supports it? Are we crossing any lines there?
Yeah, more great questions. So just to clarify, when you're talking about the government supporting Tesla, do you mean, can you clarify what you're talking about there, if possible?
In last week's news, right? We recently had what appeared to be a vehicle showcase on the White House lawn. Is that promoting a specific business? Is that a violation of speech, I guess, by favoring something, even if it's as benign as a business. Is the government required to be neutral in that case? And then also, there are people protesting Tesla. Can government restrict that because they're also simultaneously supporting it?
Yeah, that's great. So thank you for clarifying that, or putting a finer point on that question. Really, another really great question or set of questions that gets at some really important and difficult issues with the First Amendment. So with respect to the first part, is there anything in the First Amendment or elsewhere in the Constitution that prohibits the government from endorsing a product or a company, which I think is a fair description of what seems to have happened recently with respect to Tesla? No, there's not. Now there's statutes, out there that, limit the government's ability to favor, certain companies or products with respect to certain kinds of things. But if the president of the United States says that he wants to, he thinks Teslas are great, and here's a bunch of Teslas on the White House lawn or whatever it was, aren't they great? There's no constitutional, enforceable constitutional doctrine that's going to prevent him from doing that. And that does get back to the point I made earlier about government speech, right? Unless it's religious speech, or unless it's coercive speech to try and prevent others from speaking, the government, including government officials like the president, can more or less say whatever they want to for purposes of the Constitution and the First Amendment. So it may be troubling, and it may raise issues with respect to quid pro quo under certain federal statutes, but I don't think it's a violation of the First Amendment. The other side of that you raised, Tom, is, so there are people now, we're seeing people who are, protesting outside Tesla dealerships and things like that. That is First Amendment protected activity, right? If you are on a public sidewalk outside a First Amendment dealer, you are using a traditional public forum to exercise your free speech rights. You may have to get a permit to do it, depending on your locality, but the permit has to be granted without regard to the content of your speech. And those permits, by the way, are granted by local officials. They're not, the federal government has nothing to do with that. And as long as you're, not disturbing the peace, you're not assaulting people, you're not making threats, you're not trespassing on private property, that's within your First Amendment rights. And the government cannot prevent you from doing that or punish you for doing that without violating your First Amendment rights. So, the flip side of the president plugging Teslas is that we can go out in front of a Tesla dealership and chant and have our signs. And if that happens to deter some people from buying a Tesla, well, I think that's the risk that private companies take when they get involved in politics. And, that's just part of our system. That's part of the First Amendment.
Tom, may I just introduce another layer to the conversation? Professor Peters, my question is, in acting in the capacity as the president of the United States, is it allowable for President Trump to make a threat to these same protesters who are not violating any law, that their protest to Tesla or any other corporation will cause some grave trouble for them?
Yeah, a great question. So again, government speech is not, the government can decide what it wants to say, including government officials, without running afoul of the First Amendment, unless they are coercing people in a way that violates those people's First Amendment rights. And sometimes the line is hard to draw. There was actually a case last year, excuse me, from New York State, a federal case where a New York State official was sued by the NRA, the National Rifle Association, for allegedly telling businesses that if they did business with the NRA, then they would not get New York's, they might not get business from the state of New York, or they, I can't remember the details. There may even have been a threat of auditing or something there. And although I don't think that case has reached its conclusion yet, the Supreme Court said, yeah, if those facts are true, the state of New York has violated the free speech rights of the NRA by essentially threatening them with certain government consequences based on their speech. The same principle could apply, to the president of the United States threatening protesters. It would depend on, it's going to depend on a number of things. I think it's going to depend on whether the facts suggest that this is a threat that actually might be carried through, right? But it's a bit of a gray area. The president can talk all he wants. If the president starts ordering the IRS to audit, let's just say, people who have been caught on camera protesting outside a Tesla dealership, just to use one example of the powers of the government. Now I think we have a First Amendment problem. So I think there's going to be a gray area there. There's going to be somewhere there's a line that cannot be crossed where the president is speaking on behalf of the country, of the government, and is essentially saying that if you don't stop protesting, exercising your First Amendment rights, there will be consequences. Exactly where that line is hard to say. There's not a ton of case law on that. But it's a great question, and it's something we have to keep our eyes on, for sure, because I think we have seen, unfortunately, recently, that this administration does not feel much compunction about making those kinds of threats. The Mahmoud Khalil example is a very disturbing one, because it shows that in some cases those threats may become reality. That is a First Amendment violation if that happens. I think the best we can do is keep shining light on these kinds of threats as a sort of deterrent to them actually being carried out, we hope.
Thanks, Professor, for that. We are just about at time, and I wanted to finish this with one last question on your best way that we can exercise free speech, the way that you believe makes the most impactful change that perhaps everyone on this call can take away today and make, a local or federally in whatever way. What do you believe is the most effective way that we can utilize our rights?
It's a great question. I'm going to provide two different answers, complementary, I hope, answers to that question. The one of them comes from a place of no expertise at all. I'm not a political, I'm not an activist, really. I'm not someone who knows very much about what is effective political activism in today's environment. So, I guess I would say you need to talk to people who know more about that than this law professor does. But look, my sense is that one of the things that really just sort of one of the retail level things, ways to sort of protest, if you will, that's really starting to have some effect is these town hall meetings. Either going to town hall meetings of an official or representative whose views you're not crazy about here and making yourself known there, or some of these alternative town hall meetings where people are kind of just having their own town halls, or maybe a person who, was a candidate in the last election and lost to the incumbent is having a town hall meeting to talk about what's going on and using that. Those are getting some media attention. And I think that's a way at the real ground level that people can make their voices heard. But I'm not an expert in that, right? I know the law pretty well, how to actually do activism effectively. It's a little bit outside my comfort zone. The other thing that I will say, though, is just in terms of subject matter, you know, the one thing that scares me more than anything else about some of the things that are happening right now, both at the state and the federal and the state levels, is the disrespect for the court system, for the justice system. The courts are, you know, one institution of government. I think that the Congress doesn't seem to be willing to stand up right now for constitutional principles, right? A majority in Congress just isn't willing to do that. But there's still the courts, federal and state courts, who are charged with interpreting and enforcing the First Amendment and other constitutional principles. They need to know that we have their backs, because what's happening right now is that we're seeing rhetoric from certain people that is attacking the integrity of judges who render decisions that they happen not to like, calling those judges partisan, calling those judges biased, maybe calling those judges even un-American, while at the same time, you know, praising judges who render decisions that they like. And, you know, that is the first step. Attacking the integrity of judges in the judicial system is the first step to establishing a scenario where it becomes acceptable to ignore judicial decisions and judicial orders. And I very much fear that that's the next step. We're seeing some signs of that now. So how do we combat that? You know, I think the best way to do it as just an ordinary citizen is to talk to people that we know, friends, coworkers, family members, who may have some interest in this, and to point out what's going on, you know, and to maybe point out when you have an administration that on the one hand, just on Saturday, just yesterday, accused a federal judge of favoring terrorists over the American people. But the day earlier, the head of that administration reached out to praise a federal judge whom he had appointed, who happened to have rendered a couple of decisions that were very favorable to him as a brave, brilliant judge, pointing out to people that we as ordinary citizens don't get to pick and choose which court decisions we obey and which ones we don't, right? That's not how the law works. And nobody benefits if powerful people in our society get to decide which court decisions they're going to obey and which ones they're going to ignore. That tendency troubles me. Maybe it's just because I'm a lawyer, but it troubles me more than anything else that's going on right now, because respect for the court system is where everything else begins and ends, right? If you can't have court decisions that are made independent from the government whose actions are being challenged, and if the government is not going to respect and obey those court decisions, just like everyone else has to do, then those words on parchment don't mean anything at all. So I would just urge people to focus on that a little bit, and, you know, if you have an opportunity to talk about someone who you may disagree with on substance about politics, to talk with them about the importance of an independent judicial system and of obeying judicial decisions. I think that may have, you know, I think the alternative to doing that is not doing that, and I think that could have some very, very bad consequences for our country.
Tom, do we have a few minutes to go over our time, just projecting, because you're running the meeting? Do we have like a 10-minute gap like last week, or no?
We're just about at an hour now. If
Okay.
people would like to stay on, of course, like we have the
Great.
time. Professor, if you still have the time, that's great.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to stay on for
Yeah.
a few minutes or for longer
Okay.
if that's what people want. I'm happy to do that. Sure.
Yeah, Sue, did you want to have another question, or did you want to?
Sure. Well, you know, I wanted to just make sure that we're being respectful to the time allowed and that we wrap it up with just a few points. I think there was a great suggestion in the comments that we produce a flyer with some of this information. I am happy to work with the core group to do that, and then possibly request that Professor Peters reviews our information for accuracy. And then we could certainly email that out to everybody. And I also want to let the group know that we're going to welcome Professor Peters back on the 13th with a second subject matter. So we will have the privilege of his expertise a second time around too.
And Sue, I'm happy to, I can send you, since there was no PowerPoint, I can send you my notes for what I said at the beginning, those 5 points, if you want. If that's going to be helpful to you in putting together a flyer or something, I can just send you my notes, just with the understanding that the notes themselves don't go outside small group.
Yes.
And and you can use those however you want to, and then I'd be happy to work with you, on putting together whatever information you want to put together. I think it's a great idea.
Fantastic. And Tom, if you would like me to, I can introduce next week's speaker, and then whoever wants to hang on for whatever period, they're welcome to do so.
Yeah, let's wrap. I will gladly make sure we get these resources out, and thank everyone. Thank you, Professor, for your time. This has been really wonderful. We have just some notes for wrapping it up, and then we'll have some bonus time for anyone else that would like to stay. So you want to go ahead and introduce our next meeting, next speaker, and then we'll carry on.
Sure, great. I want to just mirror what Tom said. Thank you, Professor Peters, for coming. Thank you, everyone, for being on the call. Thank you to the core members, always for all the behind the scenes and upfront work for our league. So moving on to next Sunday, March 23rd, we are hopeful that all of you join and you welcome your friends, because we're eager to learn from the esteemed Dr. George Jasku, I am hoping I'm pronouncing his name correctly, from Case Western Reserve. And Dr. George will be speaking on the complexities in Ukraine, both historically and currently, which is extremely relevant. So we hope that you can attend and bring your friends.
We will send out meeting invites and appreciate everyone. So thank you all for your time. If anyone would like to stay on, I think I have about 45 more questions that I'd love to ask, and we can still hit up what is in the chat. So thank you, everyone. I will stop the recording, and then we'll have a good time.
Tom, why don't you leave it recording, and we can always edit what we share beyond the time, because there might be some good content and good questions.
That's true. That's true. So definitely a lot of interest in, how do we condense this information in a way that's very palatable, to put on a flyer per se, or a small card. I did see one from Allison sending us to the ACLU about knowing your rights, protester rights. There's certainly a lot of information to carry on yourself, like, hey, have your attorney, like ways to be protected for when you might need to be reminded of your own free speech rights. Gosh, there's so many other questions in here. One was related to religion, where they have city officials who start events with a religious prayer. And their question is that protected free speech, or is that a violation of the government in terms of offering that?
Another great question. That's a topic that has been litigated off and on for many, many years. I did say earlier that the religion clauses of the First Amendment impose a limit on the government's ability to speak. So the government is not supposed to use its power to speak, or any of its other powers for that matter, in a way that endorses religion or endorses a particular religion over another religion. But having gone back and forth on that particular topic and related topics over the years, where the Supreme Court is now, I think, on this, and we have to remember that the Supreme Court now consists of 6 of the 9 members of the court are Republican appointees. 3 of those justices were appointed by President Trump in his previous term. And so there's a pretty in a number of those justices, perhaps arguably all of those Republican appointed justices on the court now, come from a very, very strong religious perspectives, I would say. I don't think it's unfair to say that. So where the court is now, based on recent decisions, is that it is going to allow government religious speech in the context like what you described, Tom, like, for instance, a prayer to start a legislative session, or a prayer to start a city council meeting, or something like that. It is going to allow that to the extent that the court thinks that there is a historical tradition within American society of doing that kind of thing. It's this history and tradition test that the current court is very fond of in a number of different contexts. Excuse me. And so there was actually a case on that a few years ago called Town of Greece, I believe it was, Greece. It's a town in, I think it's in New York versus Galloway, where the court said it's okay for, in that context, it was, I think it was a town council meeting, I believe. It was okay to start the council meetings with prayers, as long as there were certain conditions attached. You can't exclude particular religions, right? So we might want to ask in this situation whether the prayer that is being used at the beginning to invoke the ceremony, whether it is a non-denominational prayer or not. If it is a prayer that is drawing on particular religious beliefs or particular religious traditions, that might be a problem. Is it a situation where members of the community have the opportunity to submit or suggest their own prayers to start these kinds of ceremonies? Those are the kinds of factors that might come into play, and so it can get a little nuanced. But the bottom line is the Supreme Court now the current Supreme Court has said that there's nothing wrong under the religion clauses of the First Amendment with having a prayer at some point in a government meeting or session, as long as it's the kind of thing that has traditionally been done in those kinds of circumstances. So that's a long-winded way of answering the question, but it's kind of a nuanced question.
Overall, it sounds like a yes, it's allowed for now.
Yeah, right. I probably could have just said yes.
That's that's okay. I mean, we love the context here, so that's why that's why you're here.
Yeah, it's and I will say also that this area of law with religion under the First Amendment, and in particular the ability of government and government actors to endorse religion in various ways, that's really undergoing a lot of change right now with the current Supreme Court. And I think it's fair to say that the court is moving away from the view that the First Amendment imposes lots of limitations on government's ability to do that.
Well, thank you for that. I think that we did cover the remaining questions. You actually answered some of the questions in your other answers, so I think we're pretty good. I appreciate the extra time that you spent here, and really grateful for all of your energy that you gave, and everyone on the call for sticking around. I think we should call it and wrap it up, and I can't wait for the follow-up to continue in a couple
Thank
months.
you. I'm really looking forward to coming back. And again, I want to thank you all, not just for inviting me, but for your engagement on these issues. I think that's the most important thing that we can all do right now is remain engaged and continue educating ourselves. We're not always going to agree with others or amongst ourselves about what's right, what's wrong, what's good, and what's bad. but we really do have a responsibility as citizens in a democracy to try and understand the basic issues as best we can, understanding that we all have, you know, lives we have to lead, right? We can't become experts on public policy or on First Amendment law unless we get paid to do that, like I do. But just some level of engagement is absolutely essential to a well-functioning democracy, and it's really great to see you all taking that step. So thank you all for doing that.
Thank you. Sue,
Professor, thank you very much. I mean, that this has been tremendous. I mean, the conversation has been so deep and meaningful and timely. And we're very excited that you're coming back in April.
I look forward to it.
Well, thank you, everyone. I will answer these questions. I'll send them out in the newsletter just to make sure everyone is feeling seen, heard, value all of the input. Other than that, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great Sunday, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Now I just need to stop the recording.